Welcome, everyone. My name is Aska Hisa. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement, and I am so glad that we are sheltering together from the rain and tornadoes out there here at ICALA for Seeing Sound with Hamza Walker, Micah Silver, and Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork, who couldn't be here physically, but is here, is there. I don't know if Jackie can undo a video for a second to say hi. We'll see. But Jackie will join us with video for the Q&A portion of this evening after the discussion moderated by Caroline Liou, who is our assistant curator, who actually organized the Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork exhibition in the project room. Right now, we have a lot of seeing, hearing, and feeling sound at ICALA with 3 exhibitions. I'm not sure if you noticed when you came in, we have a new mural project with the artist Christine Sun Kim. And then we have in the main exhibition space, Milford Graves' Fundamental Frequency, which examines the life and work of interdisciplinary artist and free jazz revolutionary Milford Graves. And then we have our project room with Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork. So I'm not going to go on and on because we have a really rich discussion to get to. Seeing Sound was a process of coming to this topic because we are exhibiting works that are sound-based or just addressing the politics of sound. So with Caroline and Amanda Sroka, who couldn't be here, it's Amanda's birthday, we're gonna have this discussion. So I'm gonna leave it to Caroline. All right, here we go. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Caroline Ellen Liou, and I'm so excited for our talk tonight, but before we begin, I wanted to outline the flow of events tonight so that our audiences know what to expect. I'll start out by introducing our 2 amazing speakers, Micah Silver and Hamza Walker, who will discuss the presentation of audio, sound, and music in the art space, followed by a brief Q&A with the artist herself, Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork, as well as you two. And as Aska mentioned, Jackie couldn't be here tonight, but is zooming in from Hong Kong. And the event will conclude with an invitation to walk through the exhibition after we turn on the sound of the exhibitions. And finally, for those who might be interested, we have very limited edition copies of Micah Silver's Figures in Air, Essays Towards a Philosophy of Audio available in our bookshelf tonight. Okay, so without further ado, I wanted to get started. Over the course of researching for and organizing the exhibition Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork, I began to understand how truly exceptional Jackie's work is. Her practice, as I'm sure many of you know, not only exists as a hybrid between sound and art, sculpture and performance, viewer and architecture, but really interrogates those boundaries in the first place. Given how her work straddles so many lines, I wanted to bring Hamza Walker, who is the director at LAXART, and Micah Silver, artist, curator, and founder of Black Hole, 2 figures with an extensive background in curating at the intersection between sound and art, to untangle some of these threads, tease out the nuances of her practice, and reflect on what it means to be exhibiting sound today. So I thought we could get started with a bit about your backgrounds. What is your experience with audio, sound, and music, and how has your understanding of the relationship between the 3 evolved over the course of your curatorial work? Maybe Hamza, you could start, and then Micah.
Oh my God, that's actually, so Mike can kick it off, but okay. It's funny, interesting, Micah, you'd asked earlier, in a very specific kind of way, how I got involved in this racket. It's always a racket, or all various rackets. But in terms of new music, improvised music, and I was just mentioning I had a radio show for 3 years when I was in college. It was jazz, free format. But from there, I volunteered for South End Music Works, the Nomads of Modern Music. But that was in Chicago, which has a very deep history in in terms of jazz. It's the home of the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Music, which is probably the most, if I were to say, experimental, avant-garde activities, one of the last, I guess, chapters in the history of what was known as jazz could be said to have taken place in Chicago with figures like Anthony Braxton, the Art Ensemble of Chicago, without Elliott Smith, the whole Muhal Richard Abrams. And so I got Chicago in the mid-'80s, but that was very much being able to go and see those gigs by members of the AACM, and then volunteering for South End Music Work, which brought a number of European improvisers over to Chicago, kind of reuniting American players and a European avant-garde jazz scene. There'd been something of a disconnect over the course of the '80s, I guess. So it was a very beautiful period, the late '80s and into the mid-'90s, of activity with experimental music, especially on the free jazz improvised fronts. So that was something of an, and that was before my ventures in the visual arts. So in terms of, sound or music, or at least some, and that still to this moment, in spirit, informs a lot of what I do at its core, in terms of as a presenter, wear a couple of hats, both as a presenter and as a curator. Very few people actually know that about me. The extent to which I was a presenter when I worked at the Renaissance Society. I've done over 100 gigs. But that's altogether different than, I would say, engagements with sound and its relationship to the visual arts and presenting it in the gallery. That's another strand of avant-garde activity, I would say. But one put me in a position where I was predisposed to and very welcoming of, exhibitions that were built around sound, relationship between sound and space. But we were talking, Mike, about the late '90s at one point, about late '90s, early aughts, and the kind of advent, the digital, in a way. I don't know how to, that sounds very broad and general. But the record labels, is a really fertile moment. And I think of that as a period, at least my first real forays into doing an exhibition around sound was commissioning Kevin Drum to do a piece at the Renaissance Society where I worked. But the space was not acoustically viable. And so I invited Simpark, this collective, to do an intervention specifically to present Kevin's piece. And the installation was called Spec. So that was my first real foray into doing a sound-based exhibition, at that time. So, turn it over to you. But I know that you went to, you're studying with Braxton. Was such a
yeah, we share.
So, as far as an overlap that we share.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess the quick version is I grew up in the middle of the forest where there was almost no sound, and grew up just improvising music, kind of in the absence of understanding really any kind of context outside of my parents' record collection, but forcing my friends who were into Tool and heavy metal to not write songs and just purely improvise. And then, yeah, starting to compose music using computers, when you had to install MIDI cards into giant towers and stuff. And then accidentally attending Anthony Braxton's large ensemble class at Wesleyan as a high school student, and thinking that he was actually someone else, but deciding on the spot that basically whatever was happening in this room, so the physical presence, not even the way it sounded exactly, but just the entire atmosphere, was the place that I could learn the most about music from.
What period of Braxton's was it?
So this would have been 1997.
So was that Ghost Trance.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is like just before Ghost Trance.
Yeah,
kind of, and
right, with the ensemble.
And while I was there, it was kind of the ensemble music was transitioning from these like, massive, impossible to play, subdivided pieces to, Ghost Trance has its own logic. And then I guess into curating, it's like totally random actually, because my background is someone who's making things. I was studying with Earl Brown. I didn't know he was sick, and he died very quickly afterwards. And he invited me to work at his archive, which was really just his studio, and he had no publisher or anything, so it was like sending out scores, like doing that kind of thing. And it turned out that his widow was Susan Sollins, who was the founder of Art 21 and also involved with like Independent Curators International at the very beginning. And I think that somehow, through an awareness of what she was doing, I thought, well, like this, there are multiple important ways of being involved in cultural production, not only making your own work. And so through a series of fortuitous things, I started working at a sound installation gallery in New York City called Diapason, which started out as Studio 5 Beekman. It was a small space in the financial district, moved to Midtown, had like a very, very draconian, beautiful program, which was 6 p.m. to midnight every Saturday, only algorithmic, multi-channel audio works. There were a few performances. I commissioned one that was actually kind of antagonistic to the situation, but pretty much the purview was what would now be called like, AI or generative music. And was really a small scale place for like very focused listening, kind of, post Dreamhouse kind of atmosphere. And then through that ended up at helping to open MPAC, which is like a multi-venue media arts center in upstate New York, which is probably, there's some feedback happening, which is just like, as far as I know, basically the most profound place for like audio-based practices in the country. So you have multiple venues with like incredibly quiet spaces. But the problem with that scale is it's a completely unicorn situation where someone drops a huge amount of money onto an institution, and you can make a building for $200 million and have 200 of the best speakers in the world and like rooms that have 20 decibels of background noise, and that's great. But there's no one who knows how to make work for that space, and also there's not many places you can take work that is made there. So dial forward. I now have this like very, very micro institution called Black Hole in Gardena, which is like a very small-scale, self-sustaining listening room that I see as kind of a defensible position given the economic adjacency, total economic adjacency of experimental music, in the sense that I'm interested in it, and the creation of an atmosphere that actually gives a chance for people to maybe learn how to listen in a new way, which has not been my experience. Placing my own work in museums and being involved with other people's work also in these visual art institutions there's just an enormous disjuncture between the plausibility of like truly learning something new through a listening experience in a space that people kind of wander around as if they're kind of surfing the internet. So yeah, maybe that's the broad strokes. Sure. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
And maybe to get back to the second part of that question, how has your understanding of the relationship between audio, sound art, and music evolved over the course of your curatorial work? And Micah, I know that you've written about exactly this kind of distinction, so it might be helpful to start with how you kind of define those differences between the three.
Okay, and maybe that's useful for Jackie's work too. But yeah, one of my fetish topics is that, basically, since the advent of audio, there's been a slippage in language, and we now basically refer interchangeably to audio and music as if one is the same, as if a photo of a bed is someplace you can sleep. And the reality is that, audio is kind of like a strangely under-theorized, like very, very effective parlor trick. And it's been so effective that even in its earliest forms, like a wax cylinder recording, which has basically no timbral information on it at all, you can listen to these recordings and still have a kind of complete sense for yourself that almost a human presence, or at least a testimony to some kind of human presence, is being transposed from one distant place into the present, which would suggest that we treat audio as if it's capable of transubstantiation. which if anyone, I'm not Catholic, but like I mean it in the actual sense that basically people treat it as if there's like a human presence that's able to be moved through, that this microphone is somehow extracting something from a place or a person. And even weirder, the even weirder twist on that is I think you could think of that almost as like an affective, much more so than these kind of like ChatGPT kind of like pseudo AI kind of things, but you could think of it as like an affective, a transfer that is basically people have treated as like an affective AI, where if you believe that there's this technology out there that can actually move a presence from one place to another, what does that mean you actually believe? So the book is kind of trying to make these distinctions very, very clear. And I leave music in the absence, but what I would say about music is barely even maybe about, for me, music is barely even about the type of sound. It's really like a way that people ritualize temporalities and ritualize feelings throughout, different cultures, and also find, use sound to create presence through bodies. And so there's actually like nothing, almost has nothing to do with audio at all, except that audio is a tool that can make representations of this that are like ratchet facsimiles of the actual beauty of the thing. And sound is just like, we're talking about the physics of the planet. And that becomes important to distinguish because like, sound art as a genre is a misnomer. Mostly we're talking about audio art. And, there have been very few people who maybe are really working with sound, like the physical properties of sound directly. Jackie is one of them, I would definitely say. But I'm also not sure Jackie is a sound artist. But to me, those are the three things worth distinguishing pretty directly.
Do you want to say anything about that, or?
In terms of it as, the effects on curatorial practice, recognizing it as just a burgeoning and rich part of just cultural activities and production over the course of the 20th century in terms of, thinking about a figure like a John Cage, his relationship with visual art and the extent to which his activities become kind of paradigmatic, not just within music, but, the ramifications in a broader sense, his importance to culture, just across the board, right? But to be able to survey, the various kinds of activities, I guess, that fall under, sound art, like you're saying, is a category. But it's just to recognize it as a node of cultural activity that to be able to dip into it, survey it, and have exhibitions. I don't know what to call them anymore, installations. As artists incorporate sound into their work, make sound, saying sound artist, is it their primary medium? In which case, are you an artist or musician or, what is its place in interdisciplinary practices? So having to be responsive, flexible to what it is that artists do, and insofar as they incorporate and use sound, to have to be able to, accommodate it, within an exhibition space.
Hamza and Micah, I was thinking about a little bit of the call that we had yesterday when we were talking about, actually when you were just saying transubstantiation and the presence of the artist. Hamza, you had mentioned yesterday that Jacqueline's work represents a radical departure from Milford Graves' work, and the fact that for Milford the experience is all about the presence of the artist, whereas for Jackie there's almost a complete absence of the artist, which instead privileges the presence of the listener. And I guess I was just reflecting a little bit about our conversation and wondering why you think that is. Is that a function perhaps of the different spaces in which they are coming from? One is like a music venue space that really is about the musician, versus the art space, which is really about the viewer, or does it perhaps speak to kind of a historical evolution of how our experience has moved away from collective spaces to a kind of more fractured, isolated experience.
Yeah, I just think of them as two. To think about Jackie's installation as somewhat, parasitic, in terms of drawing from, literally in terms of drawing its source from Milford. But that's I would say that's very literal and direct relationships that they would have. Other than that, to me, they're two very different, which makes it interesting. Two entirely different paradigms that they're operating under, as artists. So, obviously, foregrounding Milford, and you can't the body, the labor to produce the sound. The body's at the center, in a way. But as opposed to, a different means of generating, sound, which is really, really interesting. The way it might center around percussion, right? And I think about something as wacky as that the book Rock and the Pop Narcotic by Joe Carducci, just goes back, back to the 90s, late 80s, rock critic. But his differentiation between rock and pop, and one of the things that the line that he drew between them was the advent of like electronic percussion in drums as opposed to actually having a drummer in the trap set generating the beats. And to think about that here, right? Like, it's like, okay, one, but that there's, I think, something to be said about where it isn't just simply, you can have the absence of another kind of musician, but specifically like a drummer, and a drummer of Milford Graves' order, right? We're again foregrounding the production of sound as somatic, like in the body, right? And then what does it mean for that to be absent? So it isn't just, it's in the physical nature of what it is that he's doing. Not that that doesn't pertain to other kinds of musicians or instrumentalists. But I feel like it's there's a lot to be said for that grounding of labor and music, production of sound with the drummer. Give the drummer some. So, just some thoughts.
And in Jackie's installation, she's literally turning Milford's drum beat into like an electronic beat. So exactly what you're saying.
Right, which is again like the pop part of it, right? Like it's like, just thinking about things as, really kind of hackneyed metaphors between, it's like looking, in terms of thinking about them as labor, right? What this is clearly like, I don't know what you would want to call Jackie's piece as a, post-Fordist. I don't know where to go with in terms of, what is that a corollary for if we're going to have, a discussion about labor or,
would it be like the viewer is taking on that labor in the case of Jackie's work?
Yeah, consuming instead of producing.
Right.
Do you think it's fair? I wonder whether it's fair to think of the visitor to Jackie's piece as like a laborer. Because I don't know. I guess my sense of that, the way I feel in that room is like I'm being asked to slow down and notice very, very subtle changes to my body. To it's almost like a Harry Partch idea about like corporeality or something, but that there's some kind of like walking presence, paying attention to like very, very subtle shifts in acoustics. Which is maybe like the quietest form of musical presence that might relate to something true about Milford. And it's not that the Grave Show, the Grave Show is really like, about, and Jackie's show is very much like, within. And but also like some of the pieces here, but Jackie's work in general, when I think about her practice, I think about like interminable amounts of labor on her part.
Yeah.
Like these insanely felted, there's like a lot of very like handmade practices in labor of creating like very, very subtle physics results in a room. And to the track, it's like, I mean, this is, I checked this out with Jackie yesterday to make sure she wouldn't be offended by it. But, you know, like when I think about Jackie's work, it's like, you could swap out other audio. Like the track that's playing there, is, as I understand it, is like, you know, it's like a multi-track piece, and sounds are going, you know, kind of one-to-one to individual speakers, and then the live feeds are basically being like squeezed through that as like a sieve, and they kind of modulate each other. And there's some kind of synchronicity happening with the bell pattern that kind of takes over the Graves show, but it's almost, and I don't know, in Jackie's work I feel like it's almost, this is where it's like not like a lot of sound art or audio art that comes from musicians or people coming from a composition background, where the sense of time is really given over to the visitor. The timeline of the piece, I don't think it's more feels theorized, like, you know, as music, you know, a lot of sound artists are basically like escaped musicians and composers who felt like this will be like a half quote of Braxton, but, you know, kind of trying to expand on terms that were drawn wrong from the get-go. And so you feel trapped in music, and so you end up in this kind of like liminal zone of like sound art or audio art adjacent in the visual arts. And part of that is like, you know, people figuring out how to develop a visual language so that they can put their work in that space, because you're somehow not allowed to just have like an empty museum still very often. And so, you know, but that's not actually Jackie's path to this work. You know, Jackie's path is like a very material, I think of it more in terms of like intense materiality and like dance and proprioception. And that's also, you know, I didn't know Milford Graves personally. My sense of his practice, and, you know, the kind of like many dimensions of it, and it's, I think you used the word somatic. You know, to me that's the deep connection between the two things, is that both are, even though you don't really get a feel for the somatic nature of Graves's world, at its best, I think that's how they meet, almost like on the same terms.
Yeah, it's interesting. The about versus the within that you were saying about the two shows, like one is about, you know, and a large part of it is based on kind of documentation. So it as one kind of experience, right, in terms of what we absorb and learn about Milford Graves, versus something else that's immersive, right, and it's much more about you know, perception, right, as opposed to understanding or becoming familiar with or surveying, you know, a particular artist's output. But it's interesting thinking about having a figure like Graves. So on the one hand, we're talking about sound in exhibition spaces, when I think there's also a number of questions around having musicians, and especially of Graves's generation, in exhibition spaces. So what does it mean for museums, galleries, to now survey, you know, you mentioned the Cecil Taylor exhibition at the Whitney, right? As part of the Made in LA that I worked on, we did, you know, Wadada Leo Smith's scores, for example. And what perhaps is it about that particular generation of artists? Is it now that they're being historicized in some sense, right? And then what does it mean to try and at least raise their output to the level of visuality? Is that what's going on? Yeah. Right. How do you take this? Can that information? Can Cecil Taylor? I mean, you know, is their output, at least the level of their music, capable of being absorbed or within the dictates of an exhibition, you know, in a way, right? But those things aside, I think it's more about, you know, and you touched on this, Micah, about who, like when we think about Cecil Taylor or you, Wadada, that generation of artists, that particular period or moment, that they're more than just musicians. I mean, on the one hand, yes, they're musicians, but what their music served a purpose in a way, right? It was like another, right? So yeah, we think about them and we label them as musicians, but we know them somehow as so much more than that. Because it wouldn't just be, it's like, we could name, it's like, would you have a Don Pullen exhibition? Like you could name many, other pianists or something, from the period, but you wouldn't do an exhibition or think about, how would you mount a show of what, or would a show even begin to capture the spirit of what it is that they do, somehow.
Right.
But with these figures, even for all the failings of an attempt to force them into the box of an exhibition, there's still something to be said about, and not necessarily them as, interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary, as much as like, again, the spirit of what they were doing, or recognizing that there's something, in that period, they're children of that period, right, where they had a much broader spectrum or something about how they thought about not just music, but who they were as not just musicians, but as artists.
Completely.
The thing that comes to mind is like the sense of possibility after World War II and through the period, I think, like, late 70s, early 80s, something like that with music, is like there's a clear, there's a real sense that, the whole European colonial construct of what music and composition means and what that music does needed to be completely dismantled and smashed, because obviously European culture had failed by genociding itself in World War II. And you see that with serialism, you see that with many, many different strands of music. And for people like ACM character, these are people who are fully aware of the totality of, say like I don't know how we would describe it now, non-entertainment musics, or, music that is like has the belief that the schematic nature of your attention actually matters, or that like musical form has political and social implications. And like, I think now we're so far away from most people coming into, our late stage popular music, garbage culture, to have that kind of level of belief about music's real cross-cultural function over millennia, never mind just recent history, that people like Braxton, let's just say the entirety of the AACM, and that kind of like the belief that you can sort of put social forces in motion through music. It's very hard to find people who still have that kind of sense, and also institutions that have the memory who have been telling the story over time. I mean, my experience at MPAC was like at an engineering school was, you go to talk to a class and you'd have to start with like, why does subjectivity matter? Like just, start there. Like subjectivity is like a thing that people should take seriously. Never mind institutions that have been, what I was gonna say was, thinking curatorially, it's like, you have to tell a story over a number of years to kind of bring people listening through a history to get to a point where they're gonna understand why any of these musicians we're talking about, why, understand where Milford Graves' work actually exists as like a total life practice, as a total statement of like humanity, and all the optimism and beauty and like rigor and intellectual genius. I mean, that's the other piece I think about with these amazing black artists of the 60s and 70s. Like these are, I mean, think of meeting Anthony, I'm just like, this is the smartest person I've ever met. And the way he would talk about his life would be like, there's no room for like a black genius in the culture that I'm in. And I need to, what he would always say was like, you need to define your own terms. Otherwise you're stuck basically being limited by the terms of those who define them around you. And so if we're talking about like, our music culture, we're talking about a culture that's dictated by a European tuning system, instruments that are all based around mastery of that tuning system, an industry that's built around distributing like stereo files that are all based around those kinds of patterns. So that's a long way of saying like, we need the institution that can bring someone into a Milford Graves show and who has already told the story enough that someone can like kind of apprehend a specific take on their work. I don't think, we don't yet have those. We don't have those institutions. We don't even have like an archive for American experimental music. So, the cultural infrastructure was eradicated doesn't exist.
Yeah, to even think about it at that basic a level, right? To say that, however fraught this might be as an endeavor, to have those artists within the space of the museum, that might be the only place that we have for them right now.
Yeah.
Right, in terms of with a full, belief, commitment in what it is that they represent.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting. I'm reading the Albert Ayler biography now, and the terms of him being a rejection, a relationship to a turn after his first few records, after Spiritual Unity and Ghosts, towards the incorporation of anthems, marching band, children's song, and saying that was there's some kind of dichotomy between Albert Ayler as a jazz musician and where he was in terms of free-formed or improvised music in a way, and then Western music. And I was kind of annoyed at this, I guess the reconstruction of kind of like a rote dichotomy there, because with the AACM2, it's like, no. It wasn't, they wanted that as well, as part. It wasn't like, oh, we're outside of that. It's like, thinking about Wadada, Leo Smith writing string quartets. Like, no. There's improvised music, but then there's also, I am still interested in composition and structure. And so to not have it be like, at the same time, yes, I might have to define my own terms, but that isn't to say I'm completely excluded from, because that's already the narrative that's been in place. So it's like, even more work in another, in another sense, to lay claim to, that, which is always interesting about that particular moment in those cast of characters. So,
Maybe we should bring it back
Yeah.
to Jackie in some ways,
Sure.
but also super interesting. I guess to pick up on one of the threads that you were talking, I was just interested to hear of when you're talking about the viewer or the listener as consumer rather than, I guess it seems like there's this, what you're talking about in the 70s of having this like collective moment of having music be this vehicle towards social action, like, and how did it evolve to now when music is a consumer item, I guess, and what does Jackie's work how does Jackie's work speak to those things? Because her work is very, I guess, it's both individual and collective in that way. It's creating these social spaces, like the maze, for example. You can see these people that are trying to make their way throughout the space, but you're also literally separated by these clear plastic vinyls, so you see like how isolated you are. I don't know. Do you see her work as functioning in that collective history, or is it more an individual kind of isolated experience?
I mean, to jump back to the issue about consumer, and I don't know if I would flatten it out to consumer and consumerism in that way, as much as like perceiver as opposed to consumer in that way, even though the kinds of sound that is being generated is associated with club or dance music in a way. But that, I mean, we can talk about that as it relates to, both collective and collective alienation, alone together, which I think is a part of the experience of the
A huge part,
of the piece, but self-reflexively so. So, if we were to ask, what distinguishes, our experience here versus actually going to the club where we pass through the plastic curtain and the bouncer, and then we're not, things just like where we have to resort to dancing because we can't actually talk to one another, which is quite delightful, actually, in a lot of respects. And that is the point. It's like alcohol and an inability to communicate with language. It's like all you're left with is your body and the beat. But that as alienating, right?
Yeah.
But so be it. Good, bad fact of life. Fact of life, right? This is a form of enjoyment.
Right.
Right.
And maybe like a collective experience that we all have also. So
Right. And what does that, say about now, right? It's interesting being in Chicago, even in the 80s, mid-80s when I got to Chicago, like the blues clubs that still had some vestigial remnant of like, this is working class black culture. This is, all right, we're gonna be at the club, in a blues club, you're gonna hear the blues band, they're gonna play, you dance, ladies dolled up, it's like, then you'll be at church tomorrow morning, right? But it was Friday and Saturday night, right? Is what would go down at Lee's Unleaded Blues, or the Checkerboard Lounge. But to think about that now as replaced by the club, right, as the source of that, and what is that, but both of them having kind of social corollary, right, to working class, right, or something, or that, the club, dance, music, this thing, as also a product of the political economy, right, as an experience. But what I was going to say about just going and doing it versus here is being able to reflect upon that, right? What is the nature of that experience, right? And you might come to the conclusion that, is this enjoyable? Like, do I like being here?
Yeah.
As opposed to just going ahead and being there.
Totally.
So.
Yeah, it's very, her work is, and also I guess being at the club is kind of like escaping your body, yet you're like returning to the body in that way, where you can't escape, I don't know, whatever, the kind of somatic impulses that you're feeling and the encasement of your experience.
I have like a mixed read of it, which is like, I do kind of, I feel like the subwoofer, like the physical presence of bass, to me in that piece is more important than the referentiality of the rhythmic pattern that brings us into the club. And so it's like we can read it through language, we can read her work through language and, like correlational reference, as we all, as contemporary art tends to do. But I kind of take Jackie's work as like those things being very, very secondary somehow, and so like the stylistic dimensions of the sound that are happening there, I almost, I said this earlier, I think they could almost be swapped out. And if you think about more like the physical dimensions of that sonic material, and so the referential layer, I'm not sure with her work. I mean, and that's kind of a larger question for like audio-based works is like, there's works that are really concerned with attention over time and structuring attention. This work is not about that. The track is not. It's really more like structuring the space through time, but it could be a different arrangement and have, I think, a similar effect. And it's not Jackie's main. I don't take it as Jackie's main concern. And a couple of other works that I've seen too had that kind of feeling where it's almost like if you're someone who listens to music that has lyrics and you can never remember the lyrics, that there's something about the sculptures here where it's like. The stylistic dimension of the sound. It's like I can never remember the stylistic dimension of the sound. I'm just reading it as like a physical structure. So it's one of those things where it's like if we could all see sound, then you would see that there's this like 4D blob moving around that space, and it would make it like immediately clear what Jackie's work was sort of doing physically. But because it's actually incredibly difficult to apprehend, the work becomes more about like it's really like a challenge to. Find yourself present with the piece. So to me, that's my feeling about her work is usually like, am I able to be present enough to find the piece today through myself? And it's kind of like, connected to, other sound artists like Marianne Amiche, where it's like maybe there's 30 audio artifacts in her whole career, and they're all kind of reconfigured for the purposes of like an architectural statement or kind of a characterological statement with the material.
Right, this could exist, like you were saying, you could swap out the sound, and instead of maybe swapping out, or in which case I assume you meant like swapping out the algorithm, or did you mean
Like
Or the
different,
source
source.
material.
like different timbres, like different, it could sound like, this sort of sounds like club music, and that the club music brings the reference. Also, there's like architectural references, but you can imagine like a different type of source material bring another reference into the room, and it being
Right.
equally as interesting. That's good. That's what.
Yeah.
right? But yeah, I think I like what you were saying. I think of the pieces in that way, a cocktail, like what parts phenomenology versus what part referential.
Yeah.
And which is because like at what point even to have the reference to the club, but when we think about the club, it is we can't think about the club without thinking about the phenomenology of the club. Like you're saying, it's like, oh, those are subs. That's our associations with it. It's physical.
Yeah.
So those two things overlap in this case quite nicely, I would say, to the point where it's very hard to pull them apart.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think a material relationship to sound is even necessary? Is
it impossible to have it any other way?
Yeah, I guess that's true. That's true.
Well, something that comes to mind is like around correlation is just that the participation of listening experiences in the visual arts tends to pit different discourses and histories of ways of talking about things against things that are in a way like not meant to be spoken of exactly, or are not really like made truer through language. And so the thing about music, or we could bring it to, I think this is another connection between Jackie's piece and the Grave Show, is like, what would adequately represent Graves as like as a musical entity, as a body, as a person, as a performer, as an artist, as an everything, what does Jackie's show bring about also, like on that same level of just like a presence that is beyond language. And I think for musicians, I mean, if you hear musicians, I mean, some of the best musicians I know, like, can't write about their work at all. They're just not, it can be a quite separate area of the being. And I think that's part of the problem with, you were talking about, how can you represent musicians in these kinds of spaces? And part of it is that the descriptive language of like adequate complexity, like adequate conceptual complexity within a visual arts context involves like intense amounts of ideas around like, well, correlate this to this, and an adequately complex correlation network somehow equals like a post-conceptual practice. And I think that Jackie's work is actually, is both participating in that, but also is actually operating successfully on a non-language basis.
It's like, whereas, kind of to rephrase, like maybe a lot of exhibitions about musicians or sound artists is reduced to ephemera, whereas like Jackie's work, even though it involves the materiality of it, it's using that to kind of bring you back into your body.
Yeah, and you could say like Jackie's work is, visually gorgeous, but it's also fully invisible.
Yeah.
The actual, like where would you locate the art? Like you can look at the art in the
Right.
Is it the plastic
Yeah.
sheets? No. What is it? Where do you locate it? And it's like, okay, is it in your perception in the moment?
Exactly. Right. I mean, the nature of it as an installation is how do you make assembly is required. Right, so you have to order this experience on your own. Do I go left? Do I go right?
Right.
Can I? Is this? Can I pass through this area, or is this a dead end?
Yeah.
What do I make of this?
Yeah.
What's going on in the high end out of these smaller speakers? And how do you want to like? What kind of hierarchy do you want to construct about the nature of your experience? So you have to put it together in order to, at least if you're going to try to make any kind of meaning out of it, which is interesting about the assembly of it, perhaps slouching towards meaning, as opposed to keeping it at that level of phenomenology, which is interesting as a perceiver, viewer, perceiver. Whereas I think of the next place, in a way, with Graves to go, and just in watching the things, is the way it's all, so resolutely I can only think of like, it's like either performance or dance. I mean, you have videos of dance, like,
Yeah,
it's like where,
yeah.
so it's like a call to action on whose part, you know,
Yeah.
mine or bodies,
Yeah.
you know, so I feel like the next place for it to go would be bodies in that room,
Right.
you know, actually producing sound.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a performance.
Totally. And in fact, what you were both just talking about of how the viewer performer is really activating Jackie's space speaks to how difficult it has been to document this exhibition or her work in general, or even Milford Graves' work also, just as an exhibition in some ways. But it feels like all of the what makes it an entire installation is the viewer's experience going through this space and really thinking about how they're perceiving it, rather than an image or a bodiless image in it. And I was wondering maybe if you could speak a little bit about the challenges of documenting sounds and sound artists.
I mean, story of my life. It's like, you know, the thing about it, it's like we were talking about it earlier. It's like there's so many, you know, on the one hand, you can just say that there's problems with audio as a transmitter of presence. But then on the other hand, you could just say, we don't have technology yet that can capture, or most people don't have any kind of like rendering equipment that would be adequate for capturing the acoustic impression of the space. And certainly like the history of, you know, electronic music that's non-stereo, non-distributable through the record industry is basically like no one has heard this stuff because no one has more than 2 speakers in their life, because everyone was told that you have 2 ears and you need to buy 2 speakers, and then we have records that have 2 channels, and it's just like the capitalist music industry. It has nothing to do with like nature or purpose or anything. So for everyone who has made like, you know, sound installations as part of their practice, you quickly discover that they sound like total nonsense as documentation, because, you know, you have like some 16-channel environment. There's like a billion things happening at once. It makes sense in the room when you're there. You've spent like a year on it. And there are 2 things about that. One is that, you know, you have the time, or people making this stuff have the time to teach themselves how to listen to increasingly complex textures, which presents the problem for institutions of like, how do you actually make that work legible and teach bring people into that process? Because there's something kind of like also ungenerous about expecting that, you know, someone walks into your experimental installation that has like a completely new theory of music, and everyone's going to be like, what is this? It's just like random stuff, you know, because no one's prepared for it. And then also there's no way to kind of collapse that down into like a portable, you know, representation of the work that actually means anything. So sound artists tend to come and go, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I mean, watching it for 20 years, you see there's, you know, various waves of people who kind of move through the visual art institutions and the biennial scenarios, and kind of many kind of disappear. And a part that there's no economy of collecting and documentation and propping up that comes from the whole kind of like oligarchic apparatus of the visual art system. But then similarly, there aren't like rendering facilities or institutions that are able to kind of travel this work around in some alternative world either. And so you end up with, you know, a repetitive amnesiac area of culture, you know, where, you know, literally the same pieces are made 15 years later, and of no one's fault, because the documentation is gone, the catalogs are gone, there's no recordings. So, yeah, there's lots of material there for everyone to work on if they care about it.
But it's also interesting the way that the documentation has to compete. You know, I think you listed 3 things, and I would add a 4th. You know, which the documentation has to compete with the ritual of listening to records. Yeah. You know, so that there's a way. So it's so that and because we don't think of, well, the record. I mean, records. In a lot of cases, records are a form of documentation of a lot, but we listen to them. You know, and the kind of pleasure that we get, or the nature of the experience that we get from putting on, as opposed to putting something on and being, well, this is documentation of a sound installation. It's like, no. You know, and what do you do with it? But it doesn't fit within the format of like what I usually listen to on this thing for this reason. And so I think that part of it has to do with just it an inherent, again, competing with that ritual.
Well, there's like the basic conceit of experimental music would be that there's some purpose to listening to things that you don't already like.
Yeah.
You know, which is the fundamental like nonsense take on like the current music culture, which is that we're all listening to algorithms that give you more of what you already like, and so and that's not really that kind of discourse of like schematic expansion. Like you'd have to if you believe in the experimental music having a purpose and experimental music in the broadest sense, because experimental is just wherever you are, what is the next more experimental thing to listen to, but just the purpose of that journey, like cognitively, spiritually, whatever, in terms of curiosity, it's not something that I think people are like brought into in terms of their listening habits. And so I think I hadn't thought of it in that way, but it's exactly that, where it's like the joy of just being like, oh, let me play this thing that's gonna really hit right now, and then it's like, okay, let me put on this like
You're right, yeah.
this thing that like I just can't comprehend, and then if you put your attention, I remember like learning to listen to Harry Partch. And at first it's like, 43 tones of the octave. This is fucking bonker. It sounds like nothing. And then later on, if you train your ears, or it's like trying to listen to every note in a Charlie Parker solo, if you're listening through jazz, it's like you realize that you're not hearing it. Like you're not hearing every note. You're not hearing the difference between the notes. You don't realize that like Harry Partch is like super dramatic. It's like, and it's actually very classical, because you're tripped up by just, it all sounds like kind of like some spectral wash.
Yeah.
So we all have to learn how to listen. And
Right, exactly. Even though I was saying the same with improvised music. Right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, a huge portion of my record collection is improvised, but I know how to listen to it. And in part, I'm listening to it as a document.
Yeah.
Not as documentation. It's documentation of a gig, but I know, it's like, no, but that's also, it's interchanged, the experience is, I know that it's based on the live, that what is going on is live. It's made up in that moment. And so I'm treating it like that, and not necessarily, and in other cases I am listening to it just literally at the level of like, wait, what is going on with the sound? Like what sounds are they making? Which is what I would do if I were actually in the presence of a gig. But it has to do, it's definitely a learned pattern or something about how learning to listen.
It's like watching chess or something. It's like if you don't play chess,
Yeah,
you're
right.
like,
What is going on? Right, yeah.
I wouldn't spend the time
This
doing
is the peak moment.
Yeah, it's like a big, someone's made a crazy move.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about that with like free, like thinking about like free music.
Oh yeah.
And like Anthony's saying things like, well, he's like the best. It's like this is one of the best improvisers on the planet at the time. And he's like, well, I was realizing that I was just repeating myself.
Oh yeah.
And I think from these kinds of observations, you realize like, wow, there's like so much to listen for.
Yeah.
And in improvised music, it's like listening to like very, very complicated strategies of communication and response. And that's the thing, is like if you take improvised music seriously, it's like you're not listening to a form of entertainment exactly. You're listening to like a whole system of communication, and that has like a lot of embedded references and values and kind of feelings and meanings that can, but it, like everything, you have to find some way into it. And we would need institutions that are assisting with that, because the music culture writ large is not like bringing children into the idea that you should listen to things you don't want. don't like.
I want to open up the discussion to Q&A, but before I do so, I know that you two hadn't met before this event, so maybe if you two have any questions for each other, I thought I would invite you to ask.
We can do that later.
You can do it later.
Yeah.
Okay.
We can do that on our own time, not on the audience's time.
Okay.
Because I do have all kinds of theories and questions about specifically Anthony Braxton and breathing. But we'll talk about that later. Because I do have a theory about his embouchure, or it's specifically about turning away. It becomes more textural.
Well,
it's really, really interesting what you were saying.
Should Jackie, are we waiting for her to appear on the screen? Okay. Does anyone have any questions that they want to start with?
We have a microphone.
So honestly, I didn't understand much of that, but I did have a sentiment with your regard to trying to understand this particular artist in relationship to your knowledge base. How does she fit in, or I'm assuming it's a she?
Jacqueline?
Yeah. In the scheme of this progression of music as you suggested it might be consumed, or received. How does this particular artist fit into this genre, if it is considered a genre, or is she relevant to what you were talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, I was saying I mean, if one were to try and consider them in relation to one another, hers represents to me a radical departure would be putting it mildly for me. So, but at the same time, because her piece literally draws its source material from Graves, in terms of it's an algorithm, but the input for the sound that's generated is from the Milford Graves exhibition.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, I missed the correlation.
Right, so they are literally, connected. But stylistically, for me, they're two completely, but there is still something to be said about, in terms of the compare and contrast with them.
Okay, well, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm still in a daze of it, but I'm
It might
interested to see
help,
the actual-
to see the exhibition
Right,
as well.
right.
Yeah.
So,
Hi. Thank you so much for this really, mind and heart stimulating conversation. I keep thinking about spirituality, especially in in the sort of as we talk about both their works, the Milford Graves and the Jacqueline Kiyomi Gork. And the Milford Graves feels like a channel of literally passing through the body, the resonance is passing through the body, whereas there's a certain maybe awareness of a complete absence of that. And so maybe I guess the question is, if you could share some thoughts about spirituality and resonance and absence. I don't know if that's a question or.
The thing that comes to mind is, which I remember I was here this week, looking at both shows, and I think both artists are operating in a post-allopathic theory of body. Or a post, both have I would say a non-Western theory of body happening in them. I think certainly that's true for Graves in a very obvious way, that there's, is involved with acupuncture and herbology and that at that time in that generation really seeking for a sense of reality outside of the 50s culture, that American culture that was inherited by everyone. And I think, Jackie is obviously much younger than Graves, and it represents the digestions of that generation's children who are already kind of dealing with a sense of spiritual. I mean, I don't even know. I have no idea whether Jackie would claim a spiritual center, but I do think that there, as a theory, where there's an intersection between what people call spirituality and theories of body. I interpret both of these pieces as very connected on. I think we could have a totally different conversation here. I'm not the person to have it, but with somaticists and people thinking about just energy and attention.
Yeah. So maybe I'm curious to know, Jackie, your thoughts on it. How do you see spirituality, or the lack of or absence of it in your work?
For me, the kind of spiritual element of it is kind of comes from my own, place that I kind of create from. I grew up very atheist, atheist in the way that we had many discussions about the fact that God was dead as a child. And I kind of was very confused by that a lot growing up. I also grew up with Buddhism influences and Judaism influences. And I kind of just decided to make up my own religion when I was quite young, because I didn't understand why, if there was not a God, why did everybody talk about God so much? And I think for me, the kind of thinking about the mixture of Eastern and Western kind of ideas in regards to the body and relationship to the world was just kind of my own way of thinking and my own way of moving in the world. So to me, they're just very integrated in that way of thinking about like how it is that we experience and understand like our bodies and how they relate, That's it.
Oh.
I guess I'll take it off for a second. Whoops. I had a question about time in the two pieces, which is so different and yet, Jackie, my experience of time in your piece was being in some kind of looping present, almost like this, like the relativity of time was taking place in there, this sort of slipping between time and space and yeah, so that my position in the room had a lot to do with how I sensed time. And so I would be curious to hear you talk about your thoughts about time in that, if it was on your mind. And but in Graves' work, he's also he's doing something radically different with time, but it's still so fascinating. Like he's breaking it and shattering it in exploding it in such a way that, again, I feel like there's a new space that we're in temporally that has a continuity and is not bound. So I just was curious if anybody has anything to say about time.
Jackie, do you want to start first about time?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me that comes back to perception and how each individual person experiences time differently, and how we also experience time differently throughout our day. Time is not. It is like structurally linear, but perceptually not. And I also think about time as can be almost time travel as well, like when our bodies, like when we are listening, and we're not being present, where we were transported. That's a slippage in time, if that is not too sci-fi.
That's great, thank you. Hamza and Micah, do you have any thoughts about time, either in the way that Jackie is addressing time, or Milford, as you were asking?
Nothing outside of the role that drummers play in terms of keeping, making and remaking time, and Graves being, an amazing drummer.
It is kind of a contrast with the pieces, right? Is that like the whole, Graves is part of an evolution of the role of the drummer in an ensemble where it ceases to be about creating a metric sense of time, and it's much more about a degridded sense of flow and punctuation and much more abstract sense of pattern.
Yeah.
And that's this kind of de-quantification of jazz and de-quantification of Western music in a sense. And Jackie's piece on the one hand has this but again, I don't think that's actually the temporality of I don't interpret that as the temporality of the piece.
Yeah.
It's still this thing of it's what you said. It's actually the time of the piece is you watching yourself in time, which is a completely slippery.
Right.
No one has an answer to what that's all about.
Exactly. And so you're actually in some way removed from the beat in a way. The beat is simply, a content of the work in a way, that the same way that you would be looking at a thing,
Yeah.
So
it's not like entrained. It's not like you're there to entrain to the beat.
Yeah,
Right.
it's not at that volume, right, where you're slave to the rhythm.
Yeah, it's not like that.
that way.
Yeah, as you were saying with the kind of collective alienation, the beat is what you're watching yourself, or how you're measuring yourself watch or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, but we just, talking yesterday just about the role of Graves and the kind of, evolution of percussion and drums in the history of jazz, but the advent of free jazz, it's, for me, it wasn't really, it's like, it's not really the last thing to be dismantled in terms of the last threshold for free jazz to really be free when it enters into another phase has to do with dismantling percussion. So you get the rhythm section, you have Cecil Taylor, you have an Ornette Coleman, but they're still playing over top of a rhythm section. So, even like Ed Blackwell, you kill it, and he could change it up, or even like a Tony Williams, but not until you get real, either non-syncopated percussion. So even, realizing like Cecil Taylor had to work with Sonny Murray, and they worked together for a year without playing publicly in order to figure out what Sonny Murray, how could he get the kind of playing that would be better suited to where he could turn and flow and move on a dime. And Cecil Taylor's a very percussive player, and so it wasn't until '62, Sonny Murray's first recording live with Cecil Taylor that it's like out of nowhere. It's like suddenly like, holy shit, this is a whole new paradigm, And then Graves is another kind of paradigm where it's like, it's different modes of syncopation, like not gridded, right? Like irregular rhythmically is another approach towards,
Time.
Right, taking apart, but at the same time reconfiguring it, but it wasn't syncopated, in any sense. But that was a real, key moment in, I think, the history of the music.
I think we have time for one last question. Oh, I see a hand in the back.
Hello. So as a sound artist myself, I often wonder in terms of incorporating installing sound. And earlier we talked about a collective experience versus an alienating experience. And I think collective in terms of history and documenting, but what about collective as the audience starting to become participants or instruments in the sounds that they produce when attending the installation, I guess, and accounting for that when sharing your art out to society as part of the composition or not part of the composition. I feel if it's counted as noise or not as noise, and noise being defined as unwanted sound versus wanted sound. I guess thoughts on that.
I mean, something. If we think about when this idea of sound installation starts to emerge, and also who and how and why people abandon it, I think that's maybe an interesting answer to your question, which is that the moment you start thinking of duration, basically durationless atmospheres, which is usually the condition if you're working in a museum, because it's very the user flow and the staffing of museums is not usually ready to pulse people into your sound art work as part of a group show or something. And so you end up in a situation where you start thinking about this kind of pulseless, an infinite atmosphere, and thinking about durations of visit. And I know, this is something Jackie could speak to as well, is in an average, how long do you actually expect someone to be in this room? And what about the piece needs to reveal itself in that amount of time? And I would say your question about the way that a user intervenes into a space, if you think about how many people go into that room at once before the piece is perceptually destroyed, and should you stipulate that in the museum? There have been sound artists that close the door on pieces and say you can't leave until 20 minutes later. I mean, so I think this, and or the example, Marion Amichet's series of sound screenings or mini sound series, to just decide actually this whole idea of sound installation is basically flawed because we're interested in structuring people's attention and time. And so what is it about if you're not willing to structure people's attention institutionally or with the event? So I think to me, I just think about it's about priorities for the work and what your concerns really are. If your concerns are really about like a fixed temporal experience from beginning to end, then that should be taken seriously. In the same way that, video art or videos and films and museums have the same issue, unresolved issue, which is like, you can go to a show where like the cumulative duration of all the projects in the show could be like several days. And then you go for 25 minutes and who can say they experienced the work, So I think that's the area of question you're talking about.
Jackie, since we have you all the way from Hong Kong, do you want to also speak to that question?
I'm not able to hear it like super clearly. So from what I understand is, how many people can kind of like access the piece before it kind of, falls apart in the sense of like how I'm creating it for, like the kind of environment that I'm creating it for. So a lot of times, because I've been working in sound installation since like 2005 or 6, I've had a lot of time to like fail at what my desire is for the piece versus what's experienced for the piece, and kind of understanding how almost like, it is kind of a manipulation of the listener as well in thinking about, not just like how they move in the space, but how comfortable are they to like have so many people in the space, or it's become a problem. I can never design a piece that will really work for an art opening, for instance. There's just lots of people talking inside of your installations, makes it difficult for others to hear. So there's a lot of like complicating factors that go into that. And I try to address those that I can, but there's some that are just, out of my control. And as an installation artist, I feel like, control is like quite a lot of kind of what I do. So it's definitely a challenge to kind of create an environment that can work on so many different situations.
It's because you didn't say it, I want to make sure it's understood. It's like Jackie's work has an incredible amount of acoustic control built into the practice, not separate from what she just said. So like, inherent to the piece, there's like a fusion of like sculptural concerns and like these kind of like strategic, like can the piece survive perceptually concerns, which is actually like a pretty unique part of Jackie's practice. So like you don't hear a lot of the Graves show in Jackie's show because there's this enormous acoustic blanket that's like both gorgeous and handmade and is also like, designed very, very nerdily with the physics in mind to function, So that's the other part of Jackie's work that I love. It's like there's like a very nerdy dimension to it that's very hidden, but allows it to function in this kind of atmosphere where you have like a bell going the whole time, etc.
With that, thank you so much, Jackie, for zooming in. Thank you so much, Hamza and Micah, for speaking and being here. And thank you for coming.